The sound was louder than the crystal glass shattering on the floor, a sharp, sickening crack that echoed off the marble walls of the grand ballroom, instantly silencing 300 of the city's wealthiest elites. Richard Dalton, the CEO of Dalton Enterprises, stood with his hand still raised, his chest heaving with misplaced rage. Beneath him, clutching her stinging cheek, was Sarah, the woman who had scrubbed his floors, ironed his shirts, and endured his mother's venom for 3 years without a single complaint. The room held its breath, expecting tears. They expected her to run. But Sarah didn't cry. Slowly she looked up, and for the first time, Richard saw something in her eyes that terrified him. It wasn't fear. It was the look of a queen who had just decided to burn the kingdom down. In the sprawling estate of the Dalton family, located in the prestigious hills of Connecticut, silence was a currency Sarah could never afford. For 3 years, Sarah had lived in the Dalton manor not as a wife, but as a ghost. She was the mistake Richard Dalton had made during a rebellious phase in college, or so his mother, Beatrice Dalton, liked to tell anyone who would listen. Richard, now the CEO of the family's struggling shipping empire, had long since grown cold. The man who once charmed Sarah with poetry and promises of a simple life had been replaced by a stressed, arrogant executive obsessed with appearances. It was 6 a.m. on the day of the company's 50th anniversary gala. The morning light filtered through the high windows of the kitchen, illuminating Sarah as she plated breakfast. She wasn't allowed to use the main staff. Beatrice insisted that the girl should earn her keep. "The coffee is lukewarm," a sharp voice cut through the air. Beatrice Dalton swept into the kitchen, her silk robe trailing behind her like a royal train. She was a woman of 60 who wore her cruelty as comfortably as her diamonds. She sat at the head of the small breakfast table, not even glancing at Sarah. "I just brewed it, Beatrice." "I'll make a fresh pot," Sarah said softly, reaching for the carafe. "Don't bother," Beatrice snapped, pushing the cup away. "You'll just ruin that too." Honestly, Richard could have married the daughter of a senator. Instead, we have you, a nobody with no name, no connections, and no grace. Sarah's hand trembled slightly, but she set the pot down gently. "I'm trying my best, Beatrice." "Your best isn't good enough for this family," Beatrice hissed. "Tonight is the most important night in the history of Dalton Enterprises. We are courting the investment of the Kingsley Group. If we don't secure their funding, the company goes under. I need you to be invisible tonight, Sarah. Do you understand?" "Invisible?" Just then, Richard walked in. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, but his eyes were glued to his phone. He didn't greet his mother. He didn't even look at his wife. "Rick," Sarah said, stepping forward with his tie, a deep crimson silk she had ironed perfectly. "Your tie for tonight." Richard stopped, looking at the tie as if it were a foreign object. He snatched it from her hand. "I'm wearing the blue one Jessica picked out. It's more authoritative." Sarah felt a cold knot in her stomach. Jessica Reed, his personal assistant, the woman who attended all the board meetings Sarah was banned from, the woman who texted him at 11 p.m. about work. "The blue one clashes with your suit, Rick," Sarah said, her voice steady. "The crimson represents power. It's what your father would have worn." Richard finally looked at her, his eyes narrowing. "Do not speak about my father, and do not tell me how to dress. You've never stepped foot in a boardroom in your life, Sarah. Stick to making coffee." He turned to his mother. "Mother, is everything ready for the gala?" "Everything is perfect, darling," Beatrice cooed, her demeanor changing instantly. "Except for one variable." She gestured a manicured hand toward Sarah. Richard sighed, adjusting his watch. A Rolex Sarah had saved for 2 years to buy him for his birthday. He barely wore it. "Sarah, just stay in the back tonight. Don't speak to the investors. Don't embarrass me. The Kingsley representative is rumored to be ruthless. I need to look like I'm in control, not like I'm babysitting a charity case." Sarah looked at the man she had vowed to love. She remembered the day they met at the library, how he had defended her against a rude patron. That man was dead. "I won't embarrass you, Richard," Sarah said, her voice dropping to a whisper. "I never have." "See that you don't," he muttered, grabbing his briefcase and walking out the door without a goodbye. Beatrice stood up, smirking. "Make sure the floors are polished before you leave for the venue. We can't have the staff doing everything." As the door clicked shut, Sarah stood alone in the silence of the massive kitchen. She walked over to the window and looked out at the long, winding driveway. She reached into her pocket and pulled out an old, battered flip phone she kept hidden from Richard. She dialed a number she hadn't called in 5 years. It rang once. Twice. "Speak," a deep baritone voice answered. "It's me," Sarah said, her voice devoid of the meekness she showed her husband. There was a pause on the other end, followed by a sudden shift in tone. The voice became warmer, yet edged with dangerous power. "Sarah, is that really you? We've been looking for you for 3 years. Father is—" "I don't care about Father," Sarah cut in. "I need a favor, Xander. Name it. You know I'd burn the world down for you." "I don't need the world burned," Sarah said, watching Richard's car disappear through the gates. "I just need you to come to a party." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was transformed into a gold and velvet wonderland. Champagne flowed like water, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and desperation. Dalton Enterprises was bleeding money. Everyone in the inner circle knew it. But tonight was about the illusion of success. If they could secure the partnership with the Kingsley Group, a mysterious global conglomerate that had been swallowing up companies across Europe, they would survive. Sarah stood near a decorative pillar, far away from the main tables. She wore a simple, elegant black dress she had bought at a thrift store and tailored herself. It hugged her frame perfectly, but compared to the designer gowns of the other wives, it was understated. She watched Richard working the room. He was charming, laughing loudly, shaking hands. By his side was Jessica Reed. Jessica was wearing a shimmering red gown that was cut too low and slit too high. She clung to Richard's arm, whispering in his ear, acting more like the hostess than the employee. Beatrice was holding court at the center table, telling a group of socialites about her charitable work in helping the less fortunate. A thinly veiled dig at her daughter-in-law's background. "Well, look who it is," a voice sneered. Sarah turned to see Jessica standing there, holding 2 glasses of red wine. Jessica's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Jessica," Sarah nodded politely. "I'm surprised you came," Jessica laughed, sipping her wine. "Rick said you were feeling under the weather, or was it just underqualified for this crowd? I'm his wife, Jessica. This is the company anniversary." "Wife?" Jessica stepped closer, lowering her voice. "Honey, you're a placeholder. Rick needs someone to manage the house while he manages the world. Look at you. That dress. Is it polyester? It's tragic." "It's wool," Sarah said, calmly. "And at least I didn't buy it with the company credit card." Jessica's eyes flashed. It was a direct hit. Jessica had been funneling expenses for months, something Sarah had noticed while glancing at Richard's careless paperwork at home. "You listen to me, you little rat," Jessica hissed, stepping forward aggressively. Rick is going to be a billionaire after tonight. The Kingsley Group is signing the deal, and once they do, Rick is going to file the papers. You'll be on the street where you belong." "Is that so?" Sarah asked, her expression unreadable. "Yes. So why don't you do us all a favor and leave? You're ruining the aesthetic." Suddenly, the music lowered. A spotlight hit the center stage. Richard walked up to the microphone, beaming. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard boomed, his voice amplified across the hall. "Thank you for joining us to celebrate 50 years of Dalton Enterprises. Tonight is a night of legacy, a night of family." He gestured to Beatrice, who waved regally. He didn't gesture to Sarah. "And tonight," Richard continued, "we are honored to welcome the representative of the Kingsley Group. I believe he is arriving shortly. But first, let us raise a toast to success." As the room applauded, Jessica turned back to Sarah with a wicked glint in her eye. "Oops," she whispered. With a calculated flick of her wrist, Jessica threw the entire glass of red wine onto her own white sash, but flailed her arm so it looked like Sarah had bumped her. "Ah!" Jessica screamed, her voice piercing the applause. "Sarah, what are you doing?" The room went silent. All eyes turned to the corner. Jessica stood there, gasping, pointing at Sarah. "I can't believe you," Jessica cried, playing the victim perfectly. "I know you're jealous that Rick relies on me, but to attack me, in front of everyone." Richard rushed off the stage, his face red with embarrassment and anger. He stormed over, Beatrice close behind him. "What is going on here?" Richard demanded. "She threw wine on me, Rick," Jessica sobbed, clinging to him. "She called me a home wrecker and threw wine on me." "I did no such thing," Sarah said firmly, standing her ground. "She threw it on herself." "Liar!" Beatrice shrieked. "I saw it. I saw her lunge at Jessica. Oh, Richard, I told you she was unstable. She's trying to sabotage the night because she knows she doesn't belong." Guests were whispering. Phones were out, recording. The investors looked uncomfortable. "Sarah," Richard growled, his voice trembling with rage. "Apologize. Now." "No," Sarah said, looking him in the eye. "I won't apologize for something I didn't do." "I said apologize," Richard yelled, losing his composure. "You are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing this family. You are nothing but a burden, and tonight of all nights, you decide to pull this stunt?" "I am your wife, Richard, not your burden, and I am telling you, she is lying." "Shut up," Richard screamed. "God, I should have listened to my mother. You're trash, Sarah, just trash from the gutter." "Rick, please," Jessica whimpered, smirking behind her hand. "Make her leave." "Get out!" Richard spat at Sarah. "Not until you tell them the truth," Sarah said, her voice rising for the first time. "Tell them who really runs the company finances. Tell them who's been cooking the books, Richard. Because it isn't me." The color drained from Richard's face. He panicked. She knew? How did she know? Fear turned to blind aggression. He couldn't let her speak. He had to shut her up. He had to show the investors he was the alpha, the man in charge. He raised his hand. The slap was brutal. Richard's palm connected with Sarah's cheek with a force that knocked the pins out of her hair. Her head snapped to the side. She stumbled back, catching herself on a waiter's tray. Glasses crashed to the floor, shattering into 1,000 diamonds of jagged light. The entire ballroom froze. The band stopped playing. The waiters stopped moving. Richard stood there, panting, his hand stinging. For a second, he felt a rush of power. He had done it. He had silenced her. "Get her out of here," Beatrice yelled, breaking the silence. "Security! Remove this woman!" 2 burly security guards started to move toward Sarah. Sarah slowly straightened up. Her cheek was already turning a bright, angry red. Her lip was bleeding. She touched the blood, looked at it on her finger, and then looked at Richard. She didn't scream. She didn't attack him. She didn't cry. She smiled. It was a cold, terrifying smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the smile of an executioner who had just sharpened the blade. "Richard," she said, her voice calm, carrying through the silent room without a microphone. "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." "Get out!" Richard barked, though his voice wavered slightly. "You're done. We're done. I want a divorce." "Granted," Sarah said. Suddenly, a low thrumming sound began to vibrate the floorboards. It grew louder, a rhythmic, chopping noise that rattled the crystal chandeliers. Whop, 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 whop. "What is that?" Beatrice asked, looking around nervously. The massive French doors leading to the terrace blew open with a gust of wind. The guests gasped as a sleek, black helicopter hovered just outside, its searchlight blinding the room for a moment before landing on the hotel's private helipad adjacent to the ballroom. The side of the helicopter bore a logo in gold, Kingsley Industries. "It's them!" Jessica gasped, fixing her dress quickly. "It's the investors. Rick, fix your tie. Security, get her out now." The security guards lunged for Sarah. "Do not touch her," a voice boomed from the doorway. It wasn't a shout, it was a command of absolute authority. 4 men in tactical black suits entered the room, moving with military precision. They didn't look like hotel security, they looked like special forces. They immediately formed a perimeter around Sarah, pushing the hotel guards back with ease. "Hey!" Richard stepped forward, trying to regain control. "Who do you think you are? This is a private event. That woman is being escorted out." Then, a 5th man entered. He was tall, over 6'4", with broad shoulders and a tailored Italian suit that cost more than Richard's car. He had dark hair, cold grey eyes, and a scar running through his left eyebrow. He radiated an aura of immense, crushing power. He walked past Richard as if he didn't exist. He walked past Beatrice, who was gaping at him. He walked straight to Sarah. The room watched in shock as this titan of industry, the man everyone was terrified of, knelt on one knee in front of the woman Richard had just slapped. The man reached into his pocket and pulled out a silk handkerchief. He gently dabbed the blood from Sarah's lip. His eyes, cold a moment ago, were now filled with a fierce, protective rage. "I'm late," the man said softly to Sarah. "I'm sorry, Tesoro." Sarah looked down at him, her eyes finally softening. "You're right on time, Xander." Richard, confused and sweating, stepped up behind the man. "Excuse me, sir? I am Richard Dalton, CEO. I assume you are the representative from Kingsley. You really shouldn't be talking to the help. She's just my soon-to-be ex-wife." The man stood up slowly. He turned around. The look he gave Richard was so terrifying that Richard actually took a step back. "Representative?" the man repeated, his voice like grinding stones. "I am not a representative." He adjusted his cuffs. "I am Alexander Kingsley, owner and chairman of Kingsley Industries." A collective gasp went through the room. Alexander Kingsley, the billionaire recluse, the man who owned half the shipping lines in the Atlantic. "And," Alexander continued, stepping into Richard's personal space, towering over him, "Sarah is not the help." Alexander put a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Sarah is my sister, and the primary shareholder of the company that just bought your debt." Richard's knees buckled. Beatrice dropped her champagne glass. Jessica turned pale white. "Sister?" Richard squeaked. "But she's poor. She has no family." "She chose to live simply," Alexander said, his voice dripping with disgust. "She wanted to find a man who loved her for her, not her money. She thought she found that in you. She left the Kingsley Empire to be with you. Alexander looked at the red mark on Sarah's face. His jaw tightened. I gave you my sister, the most precious thing in my life, Alexander said, his voice dropping to a lethal whisper. And you slapped her. It was a misunderstanding, Richard stammered, holding up his hands. She was hysterical. She attacked my assistant. Alexander snapped his fingers. One of the tactical men stepped forward with a tablet. He tapped the screen, and the giant projection screen behind the stage, meant for the company timeline, suddenly lit up. It played a video, high-definition security footage from the ballroom cameras. It showed Jessica Reed clearly throwing the wine on herself. It showed her laughing. It showed Richard slapping Sarah. The guests gasped. Jessica tried to run, but a security guard blocked her path. Technical foul, Alexander said dryly. Lying to investors, assault, defamation. He turned to Sarah. What do you want to do with them, Sarah? They are yours. Sarah stepped forward. The shy, quiet housewife was gone. In her place was Sarah Kingsley, heiress to a dynasty. She looked at Richard, who was now trembling, tears forming in his eyes. Richard, Sarah said softly, you wanted to be a billionaire? You wanted to swim with the sharks? She leaned in close. Welcome to the deep end. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavy, suffocating. It was the kind of silence that precedes a natural disaster. Richard Dalton stood center stage, but he looked smaller than he ever had in his life. The red handprint on Sarah's face was fading, but the mark of Alexander Kingsley's presence was permanent. You can't do this, Richard stammered, his voice cracking. He looked around the room, seeking allies, but the elite of the city, people who had drunk his champagne 5 minutes ago, were now looking at the floor or checking their phones. In the world of high finance, loyalty has a very low price cap, and Richard had just hit it. I can, and I have, Alexander said, his voice smooth and cold as polished steel. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. He motioned to one of his men, who handed him a sleek leather folder. Ladies and gentlemen, Alexander addressed the room, turning his back on Richard. I apologize for the interruption to your dinner. However, business must be attended to. As of 8 p.m. this evening, Kingsley Industries has exercised the default clause in the loan agreement Dalton Enterprises signed 3 months ago. What default? Beatrice shrieked, stepping forward. Her face was a mask of crumbling plaster and terror. We haven't defaulted. The payments aren't due until next quarter. Sarah stepped forward. She looked at Beatrice, the woman who had forced her to scrub the grout in the master bathroom with a toothbrush just yesterday. Read the fine print, Beatrice, Sarah said. Section 4, paragraph B. In the event of gross mismanagement, public scandal, or criminal negligence by the executive board, the lender reserves the right to call the full principal due immediately. Richard laughed nervously. Criminal negligence? Scandal? A spilt glass of wine isn't a scandal, Sarah. You're bluffing. You're just a housewife who reads romance novels. Sarah walked over to the AV table, where the technician was cowering. She plugged in her own phone. I don't just read novels, Richard. I read your emails. I read your ledgers. And I read the secret accounts you and Jessica opened in the Cayman Islands. On the giant screen behind them, the video of the slap disappeared. It was replaced by spreadsheets, rows and rows of numbers, highlighting transfers of company funds into an account named J&R Limitata. The crowd gasped. Embezzlement, Sarah stated clearly. You've been siphoning money from the maintenance budget. That's why the cargo ships haven't been repaired. That's why 2 engines failed last week in the Pacific. You risked the lives of your crew to buy... Sarah tapped the screen, scrolling down. A diamond necklace for Jessica? And a Bentley? Richard turned, pale. Jessica tried to back away into the crowd, but the circle of people around her tightened. No one wanted to let the rat escape. That is a fabrication, Richard yelled, sweating profusely. She hacked my computer. This is illegal. It's not hacking if you leave your laptop open on the kitchen table while you force your wife to serve you coffee, Sarah replied dryly. And it's not illegal if I am a shareholder. Alexander stepped up to the microphone. My sister owns 51% of Kingsley Industries, and since Kingsley now owns the debt of Dalton Enterprises, she effectively owns you. He looked at his watch. Richard Dalton, as the acting chairman of the board, I am relieving you of your duties as CEO, effective immediately. Security will escort you off the premises. You can't fire me. It's my family's company, Richard screamed, his veins bulging in his neck. He lunged toward Sarah again, blind with fury. You planned this. You snake! Before he could get within 5 feet of her, Alexander moved. It was a blur of motion. One moment Alexander was standing still. The next, he had Richard pinned against the wall by his throat, his feet dangling inches off the ground. Touch her again, Alexander whispered, his face inches from Richard's, and I will forget I am a businessman. I will remember that I used to be a Marine. He dropped Richard. The former CEO crumpled to the floor, gasping for air. And you, Sarah said, turning to Beatrice. Beatrice stood tall, trying to summon the last shreds of her dignity. I am the matriarch of this family. I have done nothing wrong. I merely tried to maintain standards. Standards? Sarah asked, tilting her head. Is starving your daughter-in-law a standard? Is forbidding her from seeing a doctor when she had the flu a standard? Is locking her in the basement when guests came over a standard? The crowd murmured. The socialites looked at Beatrice with open disgust. You treated me like a stray dog, Beatrice, Sarah said, her voice trembling with suppressed emotion. But the thing about dogs is, if you kick them enough times, they eventually bite. Sarah pointed to the door. Get out, both of you. Where will we go? Beatrice cried, her voice shrinking. The manor, the estate, is company property, Sarah finished. And since Richard is no longer CEO, he no longer has housing privileges. You have 1 hour to pack your personal effects. Anything bought with company money stays. Beatrice looked at Richard, who was still on the floor. She looked at Jessica, who was being handcuffed by a police officer who had just arrived, summoned by Alexander's team. Beatrice looked at Sarah. I always knew you were trouble. No, Beatrice, Sarah said, turning her back on them to face her brother. I was the only good thing that ever happened to this family. You just didn't notice. As security dragged Richard and Beatrice out of the ballroom, the guests remained silent. Alexander offered his arm to Sarah. Shall we finish the presentation? Alexander asked with a wink. No, Sarah said, taking his arm. I want a cheeseburger, and I want to buy a hotel. The drive back to the Dalton Manor was surreal. Sarah sat in the back of Alexander's armored Maybach, sipping a bottle of water that probably cost more than her weekly allowance from Richard. When they pulled up to the iron gates, they were already open. A team of movers, hired by Alexander, was already there. Efficiency, Alexander noted, seeing Sarah's surprise. I knew Richard wouldn't leave willingly. I wanted to make sure the transition was smooth. They walked into the house. It was chaos. Beatrice was running up and down the grand staircase, throwing fur coats into Louis Vuitton bags. Richard was in his study, or what used to be his study, frantically shredding documents. Alexander signaled his security team. Stop the shredding, seize the bins. 2 men walked into the study. Richard looked up, his eyes red and wild. He was holding a bottle of scotch, half empty. Get out of my house, Richard slurred. I have rights. Squatter's rights. You're not a squatter, Rick, Sarah said, standing in the doorway. You're a trespasser. She walked into the room. This room had been forbidden to her. She had only entered it to dust and to bring him ice for his drinks. Now, she walked around the mahogany desk and sat in his leather chair. It was comfortable. Do you know how many nights I cried myself to sleep in the guest room, wondering what I did wrong? Sarah asked softly. Wondering why I wasn't enough? I cooked your favorite meals. I learned to starch your collars exactly how you liked. I gave up my art. I gave up my friends. You were boring, Richard spat, taking a swig of scotch. A boring, mousy little nothing. I needed a power couple image. Jessica! Jessica had fire! Jessica, Sarah said, pulling a file from the desk drawer, was stealing from you, Richard. Richard froze. What? I tried to tell you at the gala, but you were too busy slapping me. Sarah tossed the file onto the desk. This is the real audit. Jessica wasn't just helping you embezzle from the company. She was skimming off the top of your share. Richard grabbed the file. His hands shook as he turned the pages. She transferred the Cayman funds. To a personal account in Zurich, Richard whispered. But we were going to run away together if the company failed. She was going to run away, Sarah corrected. You were going to prison. She set you up as the fall guy, Rick. All her signatures are digital forgeries of yours. She made it look like you did everything. Richard dropped the bottle. It shattered on the rug, the smell of alcohol mixing with the scent of ruin. He fell into the chair opposite the desk, burying his face in his hands. I'm ruined, he sobbed. I'm going to jail. Yes, Sarah said calmly. You probably are. Just then, Beatrice stormed in, dragging a trunk. I am leaving, she announced. I will go to my sister's in the Hamptons, and I will sue you, Sarah. I will sue you for emotional distress. Before you go, Beatrice, Sarah said, opening the bottom drawer of the desk. I think you forgot this. She pulled out a small velvet box. Beatrice's eyes widened. My emerald brooch. I thought the maid stole it. You told Richard I stole it, Sarah said. You told him I pawned it to buy drugs. That's why he cut off my access to the bank account 2 years ago. That's why he stopped trusting me. Sarah opened the box. It was empty. But you didn't lose it, Sarah continued. And I didn't steal it. You sold it, didn't you, Beatrice? You sold it to pay off your gambling debts at the casino in Atlantic City. Beatrice froze. How? How could you possibly? My brother has very good investigators, Sarah said. We tracked the sale. You sold a family heirloom because you have a poker addiction, and you blamed me to cover your tracks. Richard looked up at his mother. The betrayal in his eyes was absolute. Mother, Richard whispered. You told me Sarah was a thief. You told me she was using me. I treated her like dirt because you said she couldn't be trusted. She couldn't, Beatrice yelled, cornered. Look at her. She's a Kingsley. She lied to us from the start. I lied about my money, Sarah said, standing up. You lied about your character. There is a difference. Sarah walked over to the window. The car is waiting to take you to a motel, Beatrice. My sister-in-law's charity extends to paying for 3 nights at the Motel 6 off the highway. After that, you're on your own. Motel 6? Beatrice gasped. I am a Dalton. Not anymore, Sarah said. The name Dalton is now a subsidiary of Kingsley Industries, and we are rebranding. Beatrice looked at Richard, begging for help. But Richard just stared at the floor, broken by the realization that his lover had framed him, and his mother had manipulated him. He had destroyed the only person who actually loved him for the sake of two women who were using him. "Go," Richard whispered to his mother. "Just go." Beatrice let out a sob of indignation and dragged her trunk out of the room. Sarah looked at Richard one last time. "I loved you, Rick," she said. "I really did. I hope that memory keeps you warm in your cell." She turned and walked out of the study, leaving the door open. 3 weeks had passed since the gala. The scandal was the only thing the news channels talked about. The fall of the Dalton Empire was spectacular. Sarah sat in the executive office of the skyscraper that used to bear Richard's name. The sign outside now read, "SK Foundation." The office had been remodeled. The dark, oppressive oak was gone, replaced by light glass and modern art. Sarah wore a tailored cream suit, her hair styled in loose waves. She looked nothing like the frightened woman in the kitchen. Alexander sat on the sofa, reading a tablet. "The stock is up 15% since the rebranding," he noted. "People like the phoenix rising from the ashes narrative. You're becoming a feminist icon, Sarah." "I don't want to be an icon," Sarah sighed, signing a document. "I just want to make sure the employees Richard fired get their pensions back." The intercom buzzed. "Ms. Kingsley?" The receptionist's voice chirped. "There is Mr. Blackwood here to see you. He says he is representing Richard Dalton." Sarah glanced at Alexander. He nodded. "Send him in." The door opened, and a slick lawyer walked in. He looked expensive, but tired. "Ms. Kingsley, Mr. Kingsley." Blackwood nodded. "Thank you for seeing me." "You have 5 minutes," Sarah said, not looking up from her papers. "I am here to discuss a settlement," Blackwood said, sitting down without being asked. "My client, Mr. Dalton, is facing severe charges: fraud, embezzlement, tax evasion. The district attorney is pushing for 20 years. "Sounds appropriate," Alexander muttered. "Mr. Dalton is willing to offer a plea," Blackwood said. "He has information on other players in the industry, competitors of yours. He can be useful." "We don't need his information," Sarah said. "We know everything he knows. Probably more." "Please," Blackwood said, dropping the professional facade. "He's desperate. He's currently in remand. He's being targeted by other inmates. He's not built for prison. He's asking for mercy. He's asking for you to drop the civil suits. If you drop the civil fraud charges, the DA might lighten the criminal sentence." Sarah stopped writing. She put her pen down. She remembered the way Richard used to look at her when she burned the toast. She remembered the way he laughed when his friends made jokes about her clothes. She remembered the slap. But she also remembered the man who had bought her ice cream on their first date. "Mercy," Sarah mused. "Did he show me mercy when he fired me as his wife in front of 300 people? Did he show mercy when he let his mother call me a mongrel?" "He regrets it," Blackwood said. "He writes you a letter every day. I have a stack of them here." He pulled a bundle of envelopes from his briefcase. Sarah looked at the letters. She could recognize Richard's handwriting. It was shaky. "Keep them," Sarah said. "Sarah," Alexander warned, sensing she might be wavering. "I won't drop the charges," Sarah said firm. "But I will make a deal regarding Jessica Reed." Blackwood perked up. "Yes?" "I know Jessica is trying to cut a deal to testify against Richard," Sarah said. "She claims she was just an innocent assistant following orders. But I have the audio recordings." "What recordings?" Blackwood asked. Sarah pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. "I was paranoid, Mr. Blackwood. For the last 6 months of my marriage, I kept a voice-activated recorder in the potted plant in Richard's office. I thought he was cheating. I didn't realize he was committing crimes." She slid the USB drive across the table. This drive contains conversations between Jessica and a competitor, explicitly discussing how to frame Richard. It proves Jessica was the mastermind behind the Cayman scheme. Richard was just stupid. Jessica was malicious. Blackwood grabbed the drive like it was a lifeline. This exonerates him of the premeditation charges. This proves he was manipulated. This could cut his sentence in half, maybe even get him probation if he cooperates. Exactly, Sarah said. Why? Alexander asked, looking at his sister with confusion. Why help him? Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out over the city skyline. Because if he goes to jail for 20 years, he becomes a victim in his own mind, Sarah said. He'll rot in a cell thinking the world was unfair to him. But if he gets out, if he ends up on probation, broke, with no reputation, work in a minimum wage job to pay me back the millions he owes. She turned back, her eyes hard. Then he has to live in the real world. He has to struggle like I did. He has to be invisible like I was. That is a far greater punishment for a man like Richard Dalton. Blackwood stood up, clutching the drive. You are a terrifying woman, Miss Kingsley. I learned from the best, she said, nodding at her brother. Now get out. As the lawyer left, Alexander chuckled. You're right. Watching him flip burgers while paying you restitution checks every month is poetic. It's not just about revenge, Xander, Sarah said, picking up her bag. It's about closure. I'm done with the past. I'm ready for the future. Speaking of the future, Alexander said, checking his phone. We have a meeting with the board of directors of the Kingsley Group. They want to vote on the new vice chairman. Oh, Sarah asked. Who is the candidate? You, Alexander grinned. I have no experience, Sarah protested. You took down a corrupt CEO, exposed an embezzlement ring, and restructured a failing company in 3 weeks, Alexander said, opening the door for her. I think you're overqualified. Sarah smiled. For the first time in years, she felt light. She felt free. Okay, she said. Let's go run the world. But just as they were leaving the office, Sarah's phone rang. It was an unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Hello? Is this Sarah Kingsley? A frantic female voice asked. Yes, who is this? This is the warden at the county detention center. Mr. Blackwood just left, but there's been an incident. Sarah's heart stopped. What kind of incident? It's regarding your ex-husband, Richard Dalton, and a woman named Beatrice. Sarah gripped the phone tighter. What happened? Beatrice Dalton tried to visit him using a fake ID. She was caught with a weapon, Sarah. She was screaming that it was all your fault. She's currently in custody, but she told the police something disturbing. What did she say? She said that the Dalton heir isn't dead. Sarah froze. The room spun. What? She claims that 5 years ago, the miscarriage you had. She claims it wasn't a miscarriage. She says the baby was born premature. She says she paid the doctors to tell you it died so she could put it up for adoption. She didn't want nobody's blood in the family line. The phone slipped from Sarah's hand and clattered to the floor. Alexander grabbed her shoulders. Sarah, what is it? What's wrong? Sarah looked up at him, her face drained of all color. My baby, she whispered, tears instantly filling her eyes. My baby is alive. The drive to the county detention center was a blur of terrified silence. Alexander drove the Maybach himself, his knuckles white against the leather steering wheel, weaving through traffic at speeds that would have terrified a professional racer. Beside him, Sarah stared out the window, her hand pressed over her mouth, her body trembling with a mixture of hope and nauseating dread. 5 years. For 5 years, She had visited a small grave in the St. Mary's Cemetery. She had bought flowers every Sunday. She had wept until her throat was raw, mourning the tiny boy the doctors told her had taken one breath and then stopped. Respiratory failure, they had said. A tragedy. But it wasn't a tragedy. It was a transaction. When they arrived at the detention center, Alexander didn't wait for protocol. He stormed through the front doors, his security detail trailing behind him like a storm front. The warden, a nervous man with a sweat-stained collar, met them in the hallway. "She's in interrogation room B," the warden stammered. "We kept her separated from the general population. She's been making demands." "Open it," Alexander commanded. The heavy steel door buzzed and clicked open. Beatrice Dalton sat at a metal table, handcuffed to a bolted chair. Her hair, usually a helmet of hairspray and perfection, was wild and matted. Her expensive makeup was smeared across her face. She looked like a gargoyle that had fallen off its perch. When she saw Sarah, a twisted smile cracked her face. "I knew you'd come," Beatrice rasped. "You always were predictable." Sarah lunged across the table, grabbing Beatrice by the collar of her orange jumpsuit before Alexander could stop her. "Where is he?" Sarah screamed, the primal sound of a mother tearing through her throat. "Where is my son?" Ah, Beatrice tutted, not even flinching. "Careful, dear. You might wrinkle the jumpsuit. It's polyester, dreadful fabric." Sarah released her, stepping back as Alexander placed a calming hand on her shoulder. He looked at Beatrice with eyes that promised endless suffering. "Beatrice," Alexander said, his voice dangerously low, "you are already facing charges for fraud and assault. If you add kidnapping to this list, you will never see the sun again. Tell us where the boy is." "I'm an old woman," Beatrice sneered. "Prison is prison. Whether it's for 10 years or life, it makes no difference to me. I have nothing left. You took my house. You took my company. You took my reputation." She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with malice. "But I have something you want. A little leverage." "What do you want?" Sarah asked, her voice breaking. "Money? I'll give you money. I'll give you anything." "I want immunity," Beatrice demanded. "I want a flight to Switzerland. I want a bank account with $5 million. And I want the charges dropped." Alexander laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "You think you are in a position to bargain?" Alexander walked around the table. "You bribed a doctor to falsify a death certificate. That's a federal crime. You trafficked a human being. That's international. There is no deal, Beatrice. There is only the question of how comfortable your remaining days will be." Alexander leaned down, whispering into her ear. "I own the prisons too, Beatrice. I can make sure you get a private cell with a library, or I can make sure you are placed in the general population with the women whose families were ruined by your company's negligence, women who would love 5 minutes alone with the great Beatrice Dalton." Beatrice paled. The arrogance drained out of her. She knew Alexander wasn't bluffing. She had heard the stories. He's at the Grimwood Institute," Beatrice whispered, looking down at her hands. Sarah gasped. "Grimwood? That's a reform school for troubled youth upstate. It's practically a prison for children." "I couldn't just put him up for adoption," Beatrice muttered defensively. "He had the Dalton chin. If someone adopted him and he grew up to look like Richard, people would talk. I had to hide him. I paid the headmaster to keep him contained." "Contained?" Sarah's knees buckled. "He was a baby. He was a newborn baby. He was a mistake," Beatrice shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. "Richard was supposed to marry the senator's daughter. He couldn't be saddled with a bastard child from the housekeeper. I did it for the family. I did it for the legacy." Sarah stared at the woman. She finally understood. There was no humanity in Beatrice Dalton. There was only pride. "You have no family," Sarah said softly, "and your legacy is ashes." Sarah turned to her brother. "Let's go." The Grimwood Institute was a Gothic nightmare of red brick and iron bars, nestled deep in the woods of upstate New York. It was raining when the helicopter touched down on the overgrown lawn. Alexander didn't knock. His security team used a battering ram to breach the front oak doors. The staff, underpaid and terrified, scattered like cockroaches. The headmaster, a greasy man named Mr. Pinch, tried to block the hallway, holding a clipboard. "You can't be in here," Pinch yelled. "This is private property. I'll call the police." "I am the police today," Alexander said, shoving the man aside. "Where is the boy? Where is Gabriel?" Sarah had named him Gabriel in her heart 5 years ago. We don't use names here," the headmaster stammered, cowering against the wall. "We use numbers. It builds discipline." Sarah felt sick. "Number?" she choked out. "What number?" The intake from 5 years ago. The Dalton account. He's number 47. "Where is he?" Sarah screamed. "The basement," Pinch whispered. "Solitary. He refused to eat his porridge." Sarah didn't wait. She ran. She ran past the classrooms where children with hollow eyes sat in rows. She ran down the stone stairs into the damp, mouldy darkness of the basement. She found a heavy wooden door with a small grate. It was marked 47. "Open it!" Sarah yelled to the security guard behind her. The guard kicked the lock. The door swung open. The room was small, cold, and smelled of mildew. In the corner, huddled on a thin, dirty mattress, was a small boy. He was thin, too thin for a 5-year-old. He wore a grey uniform that was 2 sizes too big. He had messy dark hair, and he was shaking. He looked up, his eyes wide with terror. He scrambled back against the wall, covering his head with his arms. "Don't hit me," the boy whispered. "I'm sorry. I'll eat the food. Please don't hit me." The sound of his voice shattered Sarah's heart into 1,000,000 pieces. It was the voice she had heard in her dreams for 5 years. She slowly dropped to her knees on the cold concrete. Tears streamed down her face, blinding her. "Gabriel," she whispered, "no one is going to hit you. Never again." The boy peeked out from behind his arms. He had Richard's dark hair, but he had Sarah's eyes, green, deep, and soulful. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. Sarah choked on a sob. She opened her arms. "I'm your mummy." The boy stared at her. He had been told his mother abandoned him. He had been told he was unwanted trash. But as he looked at the woman crying on the floor, he felt something he had never felt in the cold halls of Grimwood. He felt warmth. He slowly crawled off the mattress. He took a hesitant step. Sarah grabbed him, pulling him into her chest, burying her face in his neck. She held him so tight, she was afraid she might break him, but he didn't pull away. He melted into her, his small hands gripping her jacket. "I found you," Sarah sobbed, rocking him back and forth. "I found you. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." Alexander stood in the doorway. The man who could bankrupt nations with a phone call, the man who never showed emotion, wiped a tear from his cheek. He turned to his head of security. "Burn this place to the ground," Alexander said quietly. "After we get the children out. Burn it all down. Buy the land. We'll build a park here." 1 year later. The sun shone brightly over the Hamptons. The seaside estate, formerly known as the Dalton Manor, had been completely renovated. The dark, oppressive fences were gone, replaced by open gardens and a playground. Sarah sat on the veranda, sipping iced tea. She watched a 6-year-old boy running through the sprinklers, laughing with pure, unadulterated joy. Gabriel had gained weight. His cheeks were rosy. He attended a private school where he was top of his class in art. He had nightmares sometimes, but they were becoming less frequent. Alexander walked out onto the porch, holding a newspaper. "You made the front page again," he said, tossing the paper onto the table. The headline read, "Kingsley Dalton Group posts record profits under CEO Sarah Kingsley. Charity arm opens 50th orphanage." Sarah smiled, not looking at the paper. "It's just paper, Xander. That," she pointed to Gabriel, "that is real." "There is other news," Alexander said, his tone shifting, "regarding the trial." "I don't want to hear it," Sarah said. "You should know," Alexander insisted gently. "Beatrice was sentenced to 30 years. She had a stroke in the courtroom when the judge read the verdict. She's in a prison hospital now. She can't speak." Sarah took a sip of tea. Karma has a way of silencing those who speak too much evil. "And Richard," Alexander continued, "he took the plea deal. 5 years probation, restitution, community service." "I know," Sarah said. "I signed the checks." "He's working," Alexander said. "He got a job." "Oh? Where?" "He's a janitor," Alexander said, "at the new headquarters of Kingsley Industries." Sarah paused. "You hired him?" "I didn't," Alexander smirked. "The HR algorithm did. It flagged him as a suitable candidate for entry-level sanitation work. I didn't interfere." Sarah stood up and walked to the edge of the balcony. She looked out toward the city in the distance. In the lobby of the gleaming Kingsley Tower, Richard Dalton pushed a mop bucket across the marble floor. He wore a grey jumpsuit with a name tag that read, "Rick." He looked older. His hair was thinning. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a permanent slump in his shoulders. He stopped mopping as the elevator doors opened. A group of executives walked out, laughing. In the center of the group was Sarah. She looked radiant. She wore a crimson power suit, the color he had once told her she couldn't pull off. She was commanding the room, her voice clear and confident. Holding her hand was a little boy in a miniature suit, clutching a toy dinosaur. Richard froze. He stared at the boy. The boy looked exactly like him at that age. The boy looked up, noticing the janitor staring. "Mommy?" Gabriel asked, tugging on Sarah's hand. "Why is that man looking at us?" Sarah stopped. She turned slowly. Her green eyes met Richard's. Richard's mouth opened. He wanted to say something. He wanted to scream, "I'm your father." He wanted to beg for forgiveness. He wanted to touch the son he had let his mother steal. But he couldn't. He saw the look in Sarah's eyes. It wasn't hate. It wasn't even anger. It was pity and complete indifference. She looked at him the way one looks at a stranger on the street. "Come along, Gabriel," Sarah said, turning her back on him. "We don't want to be late for the helicopter." "Who was he?" Gabriel asked as they walked away. "Nobody, sweetheart," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the lobby. "Just someone who used to work here." Richard watched them leave. He watched the glass doors close behind them. He watched the limousine pull up. He looked down at his mop bucket. The dirty water swirled, murky and grey. A tear fell from his face into the bucket, disappearing instantly in the filth. "Clean up on aisle 4, Rick," a security guard yelled from across the room. Richard gripped the mop handle. He took a breath, and he went back to work. And that is the story of how a single slap shattered a dynasty and built a queen. Sarah Dalton didn't just survive, she conquered. She proved that dignity isn't about what you wear or who your family is. It's about how you stand when the world tries to knock you down. Richard and Beatrice learned the hard way that when you treat people like nothing, you eventually become nothing yourself. The greatest revenge wasn't the prison sentences or the bankruptcy. It was Sarah's happiness. It was the fact that she rebuilt her life without them, leaving them behind in the dust of their own cruelty. Sometimes the trash doesn't need to be taken out. It takes itself out. If you enjoyed this story of justice, karma, and ultimate revenge, please hit that like button right now. It really helps the channel grow. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a new story. What would you have done if you were Sarah? Would you have forgiven Richard, or was his punishment fitting? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.